So in just a moment, I'm going to ask Joel Gus to speak about his recent experience going back to Israel, visiting family, being in Israel. But because it's Parshat Bo, I just have to talk a tiny bit of Torah first. You know, every year you never know which parshiot, which books even, are the ones that speak to you, and often it's Genesis for me. And these first few chapters and parshiot of Shmot have just been, given our world, given Israel, have just been breaking my heart. So in Bo, we have the last of the plagues. And of course, next week, we enter the waters. And I just want to talk through each of the plagues because it's really interesting which ones sway Pharaoh's heart. Because any one of the plagues could have been disastrous and awful enough to change his mind. And it's interesting to look at the ones that do and the ones that don't. The Or HaChaim, who's a Moroccan Kabbalistic rabbi from medieval times, says that only when Pharaoh feels like his own life is threatened does he relent. But as soon as the threat has dissipated, he grows stubborn and reverts. So you would think, starting with the Nile turning to blood, that would be enough. That plague would be enough to change his mind. It was their life force. It was all that they had for water, for life. Of course, it turned to blood, didn't move Pharaoh, paid no regard, didn't change his mind. Frogs, for some reason, made Pharaoh concede. If you look through all of the plagues, frogs, the Torah says they came into their beds, onto their bodies, everywhere there were frogs. Frogs here, frogs there. I'm not going to sing the preschool song. Frogs were jumping everywhere. Pharaoh didn't like the frogs. Pharaoh said, okay, fine, please go. And then as soon as they were gone, frogs, they were horrible. They smelled. The Torah really goes into detail about the frogs. And then he changes his mind. You can't be free. The lice, the magicians say to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. Listen to Moses. This is the finger of God. You gotta give up. Doesn't do anything. Insects turns him, and he says, okay, fine. You can go worship your Lord for 3 days. But as soon as God takes away the insects, nope, you can't go anymore. Cattle disease, sacred cows, nothing. Boils, nothing. Hail, Pharaoh says, this time I made a mistake. Once we get to hail, he's like, okay, go. But then he changes his mind. Locusts, his courtiers come to him and say, don't you know that Egypt is lost? You have to give up. And Pharaoh capitulates and says, okay, the men can go, but nobody else. And Moses says, nope. Men are going, women are going, children are going, we are all going. And Pharaoh says, okay, then no. Changes his mind. Darkness, which the Torah says is a darkness that can be touched. It's a darkness you can feel on your body. He says, go. Changes his mind. And of course, then the 10th plague, the worst plague. The plague that I was thinking is such horrendous karma. The plague all of the plagues which began with Pharaoh saying that every male that is born needs to be drowned. And then the plague that comes to turn the story is the firstborn of all of Egypt. And of course, that's the plague that changes his mind. And then right after that, interestingly, God says the Israelites have to consecrate our firstborn to God. So as the plague of killing the firstborn, this horrible plague, and then we have to consecrate our own firstborn to God, a sign of redemption. It's just this tragic story of Pharaoh's heart hardening. And I was thinking this week that any one of them would have been enough for him to change his mind, but he kept going back to sleep. He kept shutting down and pretending that things would go back to the status quo. If I just, okay, fine, the frogs, nope, actually things are going to stay the way that they were, right? He keeps going back to the status quo. And forgive this analogy, but I think that here in our country and in Jewish communities across the world, at least this is how I am feeling right now, I think that we were asleep. And we were falling asleep to the status quo of anti-Semitism that was sitting beneath the surface. It was lurking, and we believed never again. We believed the Holocaust would happen, and that will never happen to us again. We're going to honor it, Yom HaShoah, honor our grandparents, honor our ancestors. But that's not going to happen to us. No one's going to hate us in Walnut Creek. No way. We kept going back to sleep. We're going to be fine because of our history. We're going to be protected by the world. And then it happened again. And then October 7th happened. And I think that we all believed, maybe at this point, with something as horrible as the attack, the mutilation of human beings that happened on October 7th, maybe then would be the moment that our friends would rally for us. But let me tell you, I didn't hear from a single, except for St. Matthew, our beloved partners at St. Matthew, no reach outs from interfaith communities, interfaith relationships destroyed, family bonds broken. It happened again. And we cannot go back to sleep. We cannot believe that the status quo is the status quo. It's heartbreaking to believe that. I don't want to teach it to my children. I don't want it to be real. I don't want a gate. I don't want a fence. I don't want an armed guard. But this is where we are. This is the reality, and we saw it in the Torah, and it's happened over and over again. We can't go back to sleep. So I hold this painful truth in my heart this Shabbat. I've never, of course, had to study Parshat Bo in the context of what we are living through right now here in Israel. And I hope that that's a fair way to welcome you up, Joel, in terms of all that we are holding. We are frighteningly awake, unfortunately. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Joel.
Thank you, Rabbi. And Shabbat Shalom to everybody. Welcome to all the new members. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I was asked to provide some reflections on a recent trip to Israel. I just returned this Tuesday. Okay. This Tuesday, and actually today I only found out that my 98-year-old grandmother who I was visiting passed away. Thankfully, peacefully and at home, but I would like to dedicate my words to her memory today. I stand here with humility today. I'm neither a subject matter expert nor someone in a position to have profound insights on Israel or the terrible suffering taking place in Gaza, but I appreciate the opportunity to tell you about my trip. I would actually like to start by talking about my grandmother. She was born in a small village called Skalat in what was then Poland and is now Ukraine. She experienced firsthand the depth of the depravity that human beings are capable of. I won't go into the details of her story today, but it would be safe to say that she barely survived. In fact, she was the only member of her family to survive, and the fact that I'm speaking to you here today is a miracle. She and my grandfather emigrated to Israel, and if she had not given enough, she was asked to sacrifice once again, as one of her two sons, my dad's little brother, fell during his service to the IDF in Lebanon in 1982. On October 6th, I would have never imagined that my grandmother would have to see sights that were all so familiar and don't need to be repeated at this time. It's sad for me to imagine that she left a world that doesn't clearly provide more safety to the Jewish people than the one she entered almost 100 years ago, as Rabbi said. Since the events of October 7th, I felt the need to go back to Israel. Of course, I wanted to see my grandmother and help in any way I can, but also to talk to people and hear their stories. I flew to Tel Aviv on El Al through Los Angeles, since none of the US carriers have been operating flights there yet. During my week there, some European airlines started flying. It was eerie to see Ben Gurion Airport pretty empty. It's usually a bustling place with very long lines. I stayed at an Airbnb in central Tel Aviv and was impressed that life in Tel Aviv seemed pretty normal. The streets were crowded, restaurants and cafes were full of people. The night I got there, I was even able to attend a performance at the Tel Aviv Opera. There's nothing like enjoying Donizetti with two guys with M16 sitting behind you. And every public event you go to, you're first told what to do if the sirens go off. Life in Tel Aviv was bustling as usual, but the difference was that everywhere you look, and I mean everywhere, there were signs of the hostages. Every wall had pictures on it. Every lamppost had stickers on it. The benches had giant human-sized teddy bears, blindfolded and with bloodstains on them to signify the hostages. There were signs everywhere of unity. B'yachad nenatzeach, together we will win. En yamin ve'en smol, there's no left and right. There seemed to be a lot less division now in Israel. Last time we were there as a family was this past June, and we attended large anti-government protests. But this war has definitely unified Israelis from all corners of the social and political spectrum, religious and secular, left and right, Mizrahi and Ashkenazi. Whenever we go to Israel, we always stop by the Kiryat Shaul Military Cemetery, which is in northern Tel Aviv, to visit my uncle's gravesite. We've been doing this since I was a small child, and it's a very meaningful ritual to me. Israeli military cemeteries, if you've never seen a picture, are actually beautiful places. They're impeccably landscaped, and they all look exactly the same wherever you are across the country. And the different sections of them, organized by date, serve as a chronicle of Israel's wars and conflict. Whenever you enter the cemetery, we pass by the newer section, and I was always comforted to see the fact that the last row of gravestones seemed to end in the same place where I remembered it last time. Unfortunately, this time this was not the case, with a new section opened and at least a dozen freshly dug graves surrounded by families and friends of fallen soldiers. One incredible fact about Israel is that almost everybody shares in the burden of defending the country. In Israel, everybody serves, and it's common for soldiers in elite units doing the most dangerous work to actually be from the upper echelons of the socioeconomic spectrum. Some people may know that in December, former IDF chief of staff and one of the 5 members of Israel's war cabinet, Gadi Eisenkot, lost his son, Gal, in Gaza. Almost all the family and friends that I met have been touched by this conflict, be it my cousin Yael, who's been a single mom to 3 kids while her husband Mika is up north on the Syrian border with his artillery unit. My friend Maya, whose husband is in the Air Force and has been gone for the past 3 months, while she was the dentist for Kibbutz Be'eri, where 100 people were killed on October 7th and had to help identify bodies using dental records. My friend's cousin Ellie, who's a cameraman for the TV, and told me about going down there in the days following the disaster and seeing the devastation and the loss of life. I have a large extended family in the north of Israel in a place called Kfar Yoshua in the Jezreel Valley. I had Shabbat dinner with them, and the week I came there, a 19-year-old boy from the Mashav was killed in Gaza, and the whole village was mourning. My visit in Israel coincided with the 100th day of the conflict, and there were events held around the country marking this. The movement to release the hostages has been a powerful voice in Israel, and they've been traveling the world as emissaries, meeting with the likes of Joe Biden, the Pope, the Prime Minister of Qatar, and anyone who will speak to them, advocating for the diplomatic efforts to release their loved ones. Kikar HaChatufim, or Hostages Square, is right in front of the Tel Aviv Art Museum and is filled with pieces, including one you may have seen, which is a giant Shabbat table with a chair and place setting for every hostage. To mark the 100th day, there was a 100-minute work stoppage around the country. And in Tel Aviv, there was a 24-hour rally organized and attended by 120,000 people, including some who stayed for all 24 hours. The rally included speeches from former hostages and family members of the hostages, as well as leaders and people from all corners of Israeli society. There were touching performances from many of Israel's top musicians. It's actually amazing how many songs have been written since October 7th, expressing the pain and the loss. I can't tell you how difficult it was to watch family after family get up there and plead for the release of their loved ones, for their sons, daughters, brothers, fathers, grandfathers. I ended up standing there for hours. I just couldn't pull away. The grief and the anger was so raw. A refrain that was constantly repeated was the word achshav, which means now. People would just shout it over and over again, just dozens of times. Achshav, 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 now. One theme was to ask for equality in who's released. Relatives asked leaders not just to focus on releasing the women, children, and the elderly, but the men need to be released too, everybody. Every family expressed their despair. The time is running out, that with each of the 100 days, each one is like an eternity, wondering what life is like for their loved one without food, air, water, medication, contact with the outside world. Former hostages spoke of how moved they were when they were released to find out the whole country had mobilized to fight for them. There's also tremendous anger in Israel at the government, and this was almost universal, both for failing to keep Israelis safe and for failing to secure release of the hostages. Some people questioned the legitimacy of the Jewish state if it cannot keep its citizens safe. The stage at Hostage Square faces the Kiryat, which is a large urban military base in Tel Aviv and houses the headquarters of the IDF. Many families addressed their comments to the military and political leadership meeting in that building, asking them why they're not doing more. There's an emerging realization that military force is not going to release the hostages. To date, only one hostage has been freed by the military. Instead, the families are asking for a deal to release the hostages, some saying that it should be done at all costs. A few reference the mitzvah of Pidayon Shvuim, or the Jewish duty to secure the release of hostages, which is mentioned in the Talmud, and according to the Rambam, is one of the most important mitzvot. Captivity is actually deemed to be worse than starvation or even death itself. It was stated that everyone should feel like they themselves have a family member in Gaza, which echoes what we say in the Passover Seder and what we'll read in this week's Torah portion. At the rally, the presidents of France, Emmanuel Macron, sent a recorded message. The U.S. ambassador to Israel, Jacob Lew, spoke and offered the United States tireless support to help secure the hostages. The appeals of the family were so desperate and so difficult to watch. One of the hardest speeches to watch was that of the mother of hostage Noah Argamani, her mother Leora. Noah is 26 and was kidnapped from the Supernova Music Festival with her boyfriend Avinatan and has become one of the most commonly seen faces of the hostages, as very early on a video was released of her being taken away to Gaza in a motorcycle. Her mother Leora is dying of terminal brain cancer and looked really unwell as she begged for the opportunity to see her daughter one more time. Israelis were very aware of what's going on around the world. When I was there, the International Court of Justice at The Hague was hearing the case brought by South Africa accusing Israel of genocide. This received a lot of coverage and caused a lot of people pain, first because of the significance of that word, genocide, to the Jewish people, and people felt that it completely ignored Hamas's actions on October 7th. Despite their predicament, though, everybody I met always asked about us and how we're doing here in the United States. They were worried about us. They followed the news closely about anti-Semitism here and wanted to know in what ways I encounter it and whether I feel safe. They are extremely appreciative of the United States' support and realize how dependent they are on the U.S. President Biden is very popular in Israel right now, and many people express that Israel would be in serious trouble without him. I do want to end my speech on a positive note. One fortuitous experience while I was there is that I was able to attend the bar mitzvah of the son of a good childhood friend that happened to be last Saturday, and this was a wonderful experience. It was interesting to observe the similarities and differences between how they do things and how we do. To start, the invitation said that the bar mitzvah starts at 8:45, so naturally I came at 8:45, and turns out I was the only one there for a very long time, except for the immediate families and the regular attendees of the service. But this did earn me an unexpected aliyah to the Torah, which I enjoyed very much. The Torah portion there is read so fast that even being fluent in Hebrew, I could barely keep up. And they take it very seriously. At what point someone in the congregation got up and claimed that a few paragraphs back, one word was read incorrectly. And they had to rewind a few psukim and find that spot and reread that line. While there were many differences, including the mechitza separating men and women, the prayers were the same, and I was able to follow along and participate without difficulty. It's almost cliche that one of the wonderful things about being Jewish is you can walk into any synagogue in the world on Shabbat and participate, but it's true. It was so clear to me at that moment that we are one people and one community. Our people have been divided too many times in the past, and it has always led to our demise. We can disagree about a lot of things. I know there are many strong and legitimate feelings about the war in Gaza, but we all need to work together to ensure the survival of the Jewish people, because no one else is looking out for us. I encourage everyone to support Israel and support your Jewish community here in the U.S. We need to do that more than ever. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.